This video is sponsored by Forge. With detachments such as the new Storm Spear Task Force for Space Marines being released, critical effects like lethal and sustained hits are becoming more common in Warhammer 40k. So let's discuss how to maximize your use of these mechanics, how to make the most of them, and break down the math behind when you should fish to try to trigger your critical hits more. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and I want to talk to you today about critical hit effects in Warhammer 40k, specifically lethal, sustained, and the combinations thereof. So first, let's talk about these mechanics in general. First off, they use critical hits. Critical hits are an unmodified hit roll of a 6, and while some abilities in the game may improve your critical hit to a 5+ or even to a 4+ in the case of things like conversion beams, most of the time you're going to be looking for 6s. And the fact that it's unmodified means that any bonuses you have to hit don't apply when determining whether the hit is critical. Now, being a critical hit doesn't typically mean anything besides the fact that it triggers critical hit effects. And in this case, sustained hits gives you a number of additional hits into your attack pool based on the sustained hits value for each of those critical hits, and lethal hits skips the wound roll for that roll. If you roll a critical hit, the attack automatically wounds, and you do not have to make a wound roll for it. Now, let's conceptualize critical hits for a moment, because it's going to be pertinent when we discuss exactly what we can expect from them. When we are calculating our average damage, we're going to assume that we have an even distribution of dice results across the entirety of our roll. Now, while individual dice rolls may be different than this, because obviously you're looking at a sample size of just one, we are going to be talking about today in terms of averages, which will generally speaking give you a superior result over an infinite number of iterations. So if we assume in this case that critical hits are coming into effect on a 6, each of our 6s, so 1/6 of our attacks, will end up in a critical hit. Now, when conceptualizing the effect of sustained hits on our rolls, we can essentially assume that sustained hits gives you +1 to hit mathematically for each value in the sustain. So, for example, an attack that hits on a 3 but has sustained hits 1, when you're thinking about how many hits you can expect from that attack, especially in a large dice pool, you can essentially assume that you're basically hitting on 2s. The reason for this is that if we assume we are hitting on 3s with a normal dice distribution, our 1s and 2s will go away, but our 6 will be a critical, which will then duplicate its effects thanks to sustained hits and essentially take the place of one of the misses that we got. While it doesn't actually give you +1 to hit and your 2s are still gonna miss, if you do get enough 6s, those should offset the number of 2s that you roll and essentially replace their result with a successful hit thanks to the sustained effect, which is why it essentially gives you +1. This video has been sponsored by the most impressive competitive terrain solution I've ever worked with, and that is Forge. Forge is a system of modular, disassemblable terrain features for Warhammer 40k and other tabletop miniature games. The system uses building walls that are printed in a high-resolution FDM printer, such that their components can fold and unfold, allowing for easy storage and quick assembly, with magnets that allow you to quickly assemble and disassemble. Using these folding wing tabs, they then lock together and create a robust terrain solution. The modular characteristic of these ruins allow them to flip from one side to another. So when you're playing something like a Chapter Pro 2025 format, where depending on the deployment zone, if the ruins may be flipped from one side to another, you can simply reassemble the structure on the fly in order to construct the second layout. This also means that most of these buildings can be linked together, which allows you to expand them out if you want more narrative play. On top of that, your Forge terrain set also comes in its own bespoke carry case. Each of the pieces has its own slot, so it's easy to remove from the case and repack back in. And with the ease of assembling the magnetized pieces, you can also set up an entire table in under 2 minutes. So say goodbye to overpacked closets and overflowing shelves, and say hello to Forge. Check them out in the links down in the video description to get your Forge today. So let's talk about which one is better. There are a lot of effects in the game that let you choose between sustained and lethal hits. A good example being Martial Katas from the Adeptus Custodes faction, where every time they attack, they get to choose one. Dark Pact from Chaos Space Marines also does the same thing. So which one should you pick? Now, because it gives you more hits into the pool, sustained hits is always going to be better. If you're wounding your target on 2s or 3s, sustained hits is going to be better 100% of the time, because the chance that you convert that additional hit from your sustained hits into a successful wound is very high. However, once we get to wounding on 4s or higher, things get a little bit more nebulous. This is because the roll of a 4 or higher, it's being half the results on a d6, is a 50% chance to succeed. Assuming that this is the distribution of our wound roll, and we have a sustained hit, we essentially duplicate all of our potential results. Each of our sustained hits that we roll in the hit roll is going to get 2 of these potential distributions on its wound roll. Meaning that if we're looking at it this way, and we have double our hits, but half of those are misses, we're going to, on average, get 1 additional wound. However, if we're looking at lethal hits and we rolled a 6 to hit on our hit roll, this roll doesn't even have to be made. It's simply 1 wound. Meaning that mathematically, the difference between sustained hits 1 and lethal hits on a wound roll of a 4 or higher is identical. There's actually no difference. Sustained hits 1 is more fun because you get to roll more dice though, so I don't know, take that into account. Once you're wounding on 5s or 6s, however, lethal hits is always going to be superior. Now, in Warhammer 40k, fishing refers to the act of re-rolling a successful hit in an attempt to get critical hit effect. This is very common in factions like Chaos Space Marines or Space Marines, for example. Space Marines can use Oath of Moment to target an enemy unit and get hit rerolls against them. They also have units like Eradicators that will have hit rerolls baked in, targeting vehicles. Chaos Space Marines can use characters like Abaddon to get hit rerolls, and then combo that with their Dark Pact ability that gives them critical hits. So this is available in several different factions. But the goal is essentially to roll 6s to hit, or whatever your critical target is, and then pick up anything that isn't that critical dice roll, and then reroll them again to try to get those criticals to trigger additional critical effects like sustained hits or like lethal hits. Now, the question is, when is this actually beneficial, and when are you just spinning your tires and rerolling a bunch of dice for mathematically no benefit? First, let's talk about fishing for sustained hits. The general rule of thumb is to only reroll for sustained if the sustained number, so sustained hits 1 versus sustained hits 2, for example, is equal or higher than the weapon skill or ballistic skill or the hit roll that you're looking for. So for example, a ballistic skill 2 attack or an attack that hits on 2s that is sustained hits 2 is worth rerolling. However, an attack that is sustained hits 2 but hits on 3s isn't going to get you any additional benefit, rerolling the successful hits versus rerolling the failed hits. There is a chance that you would fail the rerolled attack, which isn't worth losing a guaranteed hit in order to fish. In this way, sustained hits 1 is actually never worth fishing for. Assuming that you have no other critical effects, even if you're hitting on 2s, a attack with sustained hits 1 is only going to average 1 hit per attack roll. There is an equal chance that you roll a 6 and double your effectiveness versus roll a 1 and lose the attack entirely. So, if we were to pick up all of our successful hits and re-roll them to try to get more 6s and more sustains, we would assume that over a large enough sample size, we would get an equal number of 1s as we would 6s, and the effect would cancel out. So having an attack in the pool already guarantees you a hit rather than rerolling. There's really no mathematical benefit to rerolling a sustained hits 1 ever. That said, once you go to sustained hits 2 and you're still hitting on 2s, using the rule of thumb that we described earlier, rerolling that hit roll does make sense because there is a greater benefit to rolling a 6 than there is to rolling a 1. If you're hitting on 3s or better and your sustained hits 3, for example, a sorcerer in Thousand Suns, rerolling that hit roll to try to get additional hits, as we mentioned before, is mathematically superior. However, if you're hitting on 4s or worse, you don't want to reroll to try to fish, because the chance that you fail the attack is greater than the benefit. So to summarize, sustained hits 1, you don't need to fish to reroll. Sustained hits 2 and 3 is good if you're hitting on those numbers or better. Now, things get trickier when we talk about fishing for lethal hits. Because lethal hits scale alongside the value of your attack when it comes to the wound roll, whether or not you should fish depends entirely on your wound roll. Generally speaking, if you are wounding on 6s normally on your attack, you should always fish to try to get more lethal hits. However, if you are wounding on 5s, it only makes sense to reroll for lethals if you are hitting on 2s naturally. Otherwise, there is no mathematical benefit to fishing for lethal hits at all. So, the only time that lethal hits are worth rerolling successful hits for is either if you're wounding on 6s or you're hitting on 2s and would normally be wounding on 5s. Now, let's put all of this together and talk about the super combo lethal plus disdain. We used to call this the Fire Discipline combo because that's what you would assemble together in Gladius Task Force and Space Marines. They were kind of the first faction to do this, but now it might be the Hunter's Eye combo because that's in the new White Scars detachment. Now, the math gets really complicated here, but there is a very easy rule of thumb to follow when you're determining whether or not you should reroll successful hits to try to fish for lethal and sustain. The answer is essentially to look at all the rules that we just discussed for lethal hits. That being that if you hit on a 2 and wound on a 5, it's worth rerolling your successful hits to try to get more lethals. Or if you're when hitting on 6s, you should always reroll. However, the kicker here is that because that reroll is also being affected by sustained hits, you can factor in your sustained hit number as essentially mathematically a hit bonus when you're calculating whether or not you should do that. So assuming you're hitting on 3's base and have sustained hits 1 and lethal hits, the sustained hits 1 makes that rerolled attack effectively hit on a 2+, which means suddenly the math is in your favor for re-rolling it when it comes to trying to fish for lethal hits. In this case as well, you should always re-roll if you're already hitting on 2. So if your base weapon skill or ballistic skill, not considering sustained hits as a bonus at all, is a 2+, or you're hitting on a 2+ with attack bonuses after all of the penalties, you should always reroll when you're getting both lethals and sustains, because as we talked about before, with sustained hits 1, the value of each of those dice rolls is 1 hit, because the chance that you roll a 6, the chance that you roll a 1 are the same, and a 6 would double your effect, whereas the 1 would cancel it. However, if you roll a 6, you also get the lethal hit. So there is pure upside to rerolling in this case. So if you're hitting on 2s and you're lethal and sustained, you should always reroll to fish. If you're hitting on 3s, you can reroll to fish if your wound roll is a 5 or a 6. And if you're wounding on 6s normally, you should always reroll. I'll do my best to make cheat sheets for these and put them on the screen here so you can snapshot them and use them in your own games of 40k. So if you have hit rerolls and you're considering fishing for lethals or sustains, you'll have an easy reference guide to help you out. Now let's throw a wrench in the works here and start talking about improved critical effects. Now some things in the game will improve your critical hits from a 6 to 6s as well as easier numbers, usually a 5+. Now, if you have lethal hits and improved critical hit effect, the math is actually pretty interesting, because if you're deciding whether or not you should fish to wound, you have a 1/3 chance to roll a lethal hit and automatically wound, which means any other number that you could potentially roll gives you a chance to wound on a normal hit roll. This means that anytime you are wounding on a 5 or worse, you are always incentivized to fish for lethal hits, because you have a greater chance to get a successful wound by rerolling your hit roll, since a successful hit could turn into a wound normally, and any critical hits will automatically wound. So anytime you're wounding on a 5 or higher with a 5+ critical hit effect, or a 4 or higher with a 4+ critical hit effect, you should always reroll to attempt to get lethal hit. Otherwise, it basically only makes sense to reroll with a 5+ critical hit effect, fishing for lethal hits, if you would normally be hitting on 2s and wounding on 4s or worse. In any other situation, the math is either exactly the same or worse in favor of fishing. Now, when we get to sustained hits, things get much more interesting. I'm going to go ahead and discuss momentarily sustained hits 1. Sustained hits 1 with a improved critical hit effect is essentially just additive. A sustained 1 effect that's triggering on a 5 or a 6 is exactly the same as an enhanced sustained effect that's triggering only on a 6. So sustained hits 1 is essentially mathematically identical to any higher sustain multiplied by the number of criticals that it triggers on. For example, a sustained hit that triggers on a 5 or a 6 is exactly the same as a sustained 2 that triggers only on a 5. But because it's so interesting to discuss, now it's really easy to sort of visualize how a sustained hit works. Essentially, the value of any one of your normal hits when we're considering whether or not we re-roll a regular hit is 1. So let's say, for example, we rolled our normal distribution of dice over here, and any of the normal hits, let's say we're on a 3+, any of these normal hits are worth exactly 1 hit because we've already hit with them. However, sustained values add a wrench in those works because many values become worth more than 1. So let's say we have a Gladiator Reaper. This is, I don't know, it's an amalgamation of gladiators that's on Tabletop Simulator. Let's pretend it's a Reaper right now, which has sustained hits 2 against infantry and weakened in Ironstorm Spearhead, improve its criticals to 5+. So that, if we're considering the value of its dice results, adds some additional value to our 5s and 6s. If we consider the roll of a 3 or a 4, in this case, is worth 1 hit apiece, the sustained values are going to be worth 3, because you're going to get a normal hit and you're going to add 2 additional hits from sustain. That means that the total value of each of our attacks is worth greater than 6. Now, to determine the average number of hits per attack, we're going to take this total of hits that we could possibly get, 3 for each of our 5s and 6s, and 1 for each of our 3s and 4s, and we're going to get a total of 8, and divide that by 6, which is the number of dice facings on the dice, the number of total results. So we can expect about 1.3 hits per attack because this thing has improved criticals and a huge sustained value, which means that because the average value of each of our attacks is greater than 1, you should always be fishing to reroll. This is obviously true for all of the other varieties of sustained hits. However, it's much easier to create like easy to remember sort of mnemonic devices for those ones. For example, determining whether or not your sustained value is equal to or less than your ballistic skill characteristic for standard sustains and deciding whether or not you're going to reroll. It becomes much weirder once you start to stack effects like improved criticals and multiple sustained hits. Once we get to this stage, it helps to visualize the dice results like this when you're determining whether or not you should reroll. So to make a long story short, if you are firing a Gladiator Reaper with Mercy as weakness at a target or an improved critical hit effect, and you are sustained hits 2 or better, you should reroll that. If we were sustained 1, let's consider, we would only generate 2 hits for each of these improved criticals. The average number of hits from each of these attacks is still only 1, because we have 6 potential results here out of the 6 possible dice results, which means that you shouldn't reroll, because having 1 hit already isn't mathematically better than rerolling, so you shouldn't do it. Once you get to sustained hits 2, though, it suddenly makes sense. Now, an almost identical arithmetic is with the new Knight Defender from the Knight Codex. I don't have a Knight Defender on Tabletop Simulator here, so here's a Knight Crusader. I don't know, close enough. The Knight Defender has the conversion keyword on its big conversion beamer, which gives it critical 4+ and sustain D3 if it's within half range of its target. Sustain D3 is the equivalent of sustained hits 2 that we just did with the Gladiator Reaper. So if we consider here a critical 4+, and we do the same little device we did previously, a 3 equals 1 hit, the result of a 3 on our roll. A 1 or a 2 is going to miss because he hits on a 3 normally. A 3 equals 1 hit, but 4, 5, or 6 are criticals. On average, on a D3, we're going to add 2 additional hits for each of those critical results, which gives us an absolutely astronomical average hit per shot. It's actually 1.66. 1 and 2/3 hits per attack, which means that, let's say it rolls 2 criticals and a hit, you are actually incentivized to re-roll the successful hit if you have a floating reroll from the army ability, most likely. You're actually incentivized to re-roll that because the chance of you rolling a critical is worth more than the hit that you currently have. This isn't the case for a lot of other situations, but this guy is so likely to roll a critical, and his criticals are so effective that, assuming you don't have any misses to reroll, you should be re-rolling successful non-critical hits in order to try to get those. So you should always be fishing, even if it's just on single attacks with this guy. He is probably one of the highest upside sustained hits attackers in the entire game. Very few other units have a sustained hits value that's quite this impressive. Now let's capstone this whole discussion by talking about all of these things together. Improved critical hits, plus sustained hits, plus lethal hits, plus rerolls to try to fish. Now, I'm going to talk about this in the context of sustained hits 1. I'm not going to go into the math behind higher sustained hit values. However, if we're talking about sustained hits 1 with improved critical, lethal, sustained, it's actually very simple. It seems like it would be very complicated, but it's actually very straightforward. If you're hitting on 2s or 3s, the math says you should always reroll to try to get 5 up critical, lethal, sustained. If you have it, all those things together, always fish, because the potential wounds out of one of your attacks is much greater than the value of any of your attacks that you're holding. If you're hitting on 5s, you're fishing for criticals anyway because you're rerolling all of your misses. So the math there doesn't matter. The only time it's not worth rerolling in these cases is if you're specifically hitting on exactly 4s and wounding on 2s or 3s. In those cases, it's either identical or slightly worse for you to try to reroll your successful hits into getting more criticals. But the combination of those effects is so astronomically powerful that it's better to reroll in almost every other case to try to get additionals of those results. In a nutshell, that's a summary of the math behind lethal and sustained hits in Warhammer 40k. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Let me know down in the comment section what you think about it, what combos you want to use with, and what combos you want to use alongside these effects. Let me know as well if you have any other tactics, concepts, or things that you want me to discuss. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.